So David McInnes, I'm going to pose the first question to you, if I may. And ideally, it's going to help provide us with a sense of building on where Dominic has taken us, and that is, aspirationally, what more needs to be done here in Canada to respond to some of these challenges that Dominic has highlighted. He's highlighted some areas where we're doing some great work, world leading, and maybe some other areas where there's more to do. I just thought we'd ask you to reflect on that a little bit. Take it away.
Well, thank you. First of all, I thought the presentation was fabulous. There's so much to choose from. But in my mind, when I think about what Dominic presented and the challenge we have, it sort of begs one big question. And that is, what is the role for Canada in not only tackling the trying to resolve or tackle the big challenges, but what's our overall role? And I think we can get a little loose and perhaps a little complacent with our "we can feed the world" attitude, or nourish the world. But you know, we've got the land, we've got the water, we've got a pretty good governance system, we have a collaborative spirit. We're all good. No more we need to do. We just have to stay abreast with what others are doing, and we're going to be good. We're going to be fine here. I'm not so sure that complacency is satisfactory. And in fact, it might be outright dangerous. Because the world is changing. And I think that maybe we should start thinking about if we're going to play, as we will, a global role and to feed our own population, so domestically, internationally. I think we need to change the way we describe that global place. And it's no longer sufficient to say we're going to be the major contributor or a major contributor to feed that global hungry world. I think it's about how we do so sustainably, how we do so responsibly, how we do so in a way that's perhaps even ethical, which is a minefield in the food space for sure. But I think we need to talk more about how we produce our food as opposed to only talking about what we produce. And I think the consumer, the investor, the supply chains, the producers are all focused on doing better and doing more with less. And I think it's a hallmark of Canada and Canadians that perhaps we can do that just a little bit better than others. And I think that I'm from Nova Scotia originally, and I'm always amazed and impressed when I come out west. That drive and spirit here, and the hub of activity in this innovation center. There's a lovely spirit. There's a captivating spirit, and I think we need to leverage that so that we're not complacent because we can afford to be. I think that's a dangerous place and not a good spot for us to show leadership going forward.
David, thank you. It's important to hear that voice, that there is some urgency to the questions and the tasks that are associated with the Sustainable Development Goals and also with the Global Nutrition Report. We'll come back to you, David. Adrienne, I'd like to just ask of you if you might be able to just walk us through some elements of the new Feminist International Assistance Policy. Dominic has highlighted the significance of the approach that Canada has taken. I think many of us in this room have a visceral understanding based on our own experience or experiences globally and locally. But could you just walk us through maybe the pillars of what that's actually included?
Sure. So I think the best place to start is the main objective of our international assistance policy. It is still to contribute to global poverty eradication efforts. And our policy, what makes the Feminist International Assistance Policy different is that it's based on evidence that the most effective way to eradicate poverty and address inequality for everyone is to empower women and girls so that they can reach their full potential. Most of the world's most poor and vulnerable people depend on agriculture and food systems for their survival. You've seen some of the statistics in Dominic's presentation, but I'm going to go over them again with you because they're poignant. 3.9 billion people, which is 50% of the global population, live in rural areas. Of these, 2.1 billion people, or 27%, work in agriculture. 20 million live in extreme poverty, while 821 million are undernourished. And that brings us now to the focus beneficiary group of Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, women and girls. Globally, 60% of the world's undernourished people are women and girls. In the least developed countries, 79% of women report agriculture as their primary source of livelihood, but less than 20% of landholders are women. Women produce 50% of the world's food, but only earn 10% of the income. There's an opportunity here, as women and girls are powerful agents of change who often carry the roles of primary caregivers and as the main producers of food for their families and their communities. This makes them key drivers in developing sustainable solutions, as they are the entry point for the health and well-being of their families and their communities. However, the underlying conditions of many of traditional and underdeveloped food systems are entrenched in gender inequalities by limiting access to food, nutrition, and economic resources for women, in addition to placing a disproportionate amount of the labor burden on women themselves. Food security and malnutrition remain persistent impediments to global prosperity and economic growth. With equitable access to productive resources, and this is where everything gets very interesting, women could increase agricultural yields by 20 to 30%. Closing this yield gap can contribute to lifting as many as 150 million people out of hunger and poverty. And when women control additional income from agriculture or food systems, we've all heard this before, they spend more of it on food, health, education for their children, and than their male counterparts do. Now back to Canada's feminist policy. The policy supports a shift towards an integrated approach to international assistance across 6 action areas that allow Canada to deliver the transformational change to those who are most in need. And agriculture and food systems are an important sector for delivering on these objectives, as they are one of the most integrated areas of this programming, and can deliver results across many of the action areas.
Adriana, thanks very much. I think you've helped us. You know, Carol and Shauna and I were at Global Affairs Canada, and Minister Bibeau was right there, and she recognized Carol right away. And she said, "How's your work in Ethiopia?" And when we begin to understand the significance of the work of working with tens of thousands of farmers, half of them are women, by the way, in Ethiopia, we get a sense that the minister takes this very seriously, and you've helped us to understand in part why that big picture. Bill, we're gonna turn to you and ask a little bit about PIC, about your connection as you're giving this new initiative lift, which is just a terrific initiative, one of Canada's superclusters, home right here in Saskatchewan for the prairies. What should we and what could we do more to in a sense, think a little bit about where Dominic was taking us? What about this connective tissue that business and producers may be able to help out with as we said about the work with the supercluster.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think three things struck me when I was reading the Global Nutrition Report and listening to Dominic talk today. And that's about, this concept of providing nutrition to the world within our planetary boundaries. I think maybe I would leave that to Jean to comment on, because that's the producer's piece. But the other two that came up were around different approaches to addressing the concern and the involvement of the private sector. In my time at Protein Industries Canada, I've had a number of discussions with private sector organizations that want to participate in the role that they can play in global nutrition from a humanitarian perspective and from a food aid perspective, but also as a business to themselves. So I think there's one opportunity there. But the other is, the other thing that struck me was the indicators of malnutrition in the report. And five out of 8 of those global nutrition indicators referenced in the report have nothing to do with what I would have considered, traditional issues around undernourishment. 5 of those can be directly influenced and lined up with the Western diet, and that's adult obesity and childhood and adult overweight, sodium intake, and high blood pressure. So when I think about the work that Protein Industries Canada is going to undertake, which again, is an economic development agency that we're undertaking here, but there's an opportunity here to help Canada and the world improve the nutrition with the work that we're going to undertake at Protein Industries Canada by helping to provide products that improve the quality of Western diets and transitioning to more of a plant-based protein diet. So, we can help address issues around high blood pressure and obesity in overweight adults and children. We know that largely traces back to lifestyle and food choices, largely driven by the Western diet. Increasingly, we are more sedentary. We rely more on convenience-type foods. And so the opportunity for the Western Canadian producer base and industry to provide healthy alternatives and plant ingredients and products to help address some of those concerns, I think is a real opportunity. And we know that changing the typical Western diet can help reverse a lot of those trends. But one of the biggest challenges and issues we have in doing that is how easily accessible plant-based proteins are and how affordable they are in Western Canadian diets and even in developing economies. I didn't know what a flexitarian was until October 15th when I started this job, but I've become one just to give it a go. I don't eat meat on Wednesdays. I was in the airport in Winnipeg yesterday. The only thing I could eat was a salad and a bowl of soup. It cost me $27. I could have had a burger for $11, right? And so I think there is an opportunity here for us if we get this right in terms of supplying the demand for plant-based protein and just changing that Western diet a little bit to get on that wave and do it in a way that supports economic development and the interests of Protein Industries Canada, but really helps stem the tide of some of the things that were talked about and the malnutrition indicators that have been identified in the report.
Bill, thanks very much. Those are important examples of just daily choices that we make. I am going to turn to Jean, actually, and just say, Jean, we've got a long history, especially in Western Canada, about meeting global market needs. And just from your perspective, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are there. There are a number of other global indicators. How do we help connect some of these dots between activities that are underway and some of these global aspirations?
So I think, thinking I might have to do this. So I think that overall, first of all, I should tell you that I am here as the voice of Saskatchewan farmers and perhaps even Western Canadian farmers. So if you wonder where I'm coming from, that's definitely what it is. First of all, I think one of the things that has been sorely lacking for a very long time is the participation of primary producers in these discussions. So when I look at nutrition and malnutrition and what do farmers think, I don't think you're going to like my answer. My answer is not much. I have been paid for production. and I continue to be paid for production. So our drive towards larger production is being driven by industry. I look at the life sciences that want to sell me more fertilizer, they want to sell me more chemicals. I look at machinery dealerships that grow bigger and larger and more technologically advanced equipment to allow me to do things more efficiently and even more sustainably. And I look at that and I go, where does nutrition fit in here? I had the great pleasure of meeting with some of my clients. I run a small consultancy for ag marketing the other night. So I took the opportunity to talk to them about this very subject. I said, what do you know about what we do in terms of feeding the world? We fill empty bellies. How do we do that? Well, we produce as much as we can and we ship it overseas so they can make it into food that they like to eat. Not loving this answer all that much. But how do you think we can help with the global problems of malnutrition? And I had gone through and explained that it wasn't just about feeding empty bellies anymore. It was about obesity and all of those things. And they said, how am I going to know this stuff? First of all, how do I know this? We haven't done a very good job within this community of including us. We as farmers, we invest all over the place. We invest through our tax money. We invest through our mandatory levies to all of our consumer groups. But we are very seldom allowed in on the bottom conversation to understand what our effect is. So I thank you all today for doing that. And I challenge you to make sure that all of us, every producer, whether you are talking about Jean Harrington in affluent Saskatchewan, or whether you're talking about the people that you're working with in Ethiopia, that we become part of that conversation. Because if you cannot guarantee that I will be economically viable, I will guarantee you I will not be sustainable, and I will not be able to help you solve that problem. And I sure as the heck am not going to be able to advance beyond filling an empty belly. So thank you very much for having me here.
That just makes great sense, actually. We probably need a healthy dose of that on a regular basis, all of us, just to remind us of the significance of what goes on in our fields, around tables where decisions are made. Thank you. We really appreciate it. Mary, I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about the significance of pulses. And a little bit about the significance of the college, obviously, in that, but with some of the broader conversations about nutritional demands and needs as we go forward.
Thank you. So the college has been working for many years on developing pulses that will adapt to different climates, and clearly we have to continue doing that as climate changes all the way around the world. There are different other stresses. There's water stresses and pests and all of those kinds of things that we are also looking to help provide by breeding new crops and breeding new traits into the crops we have so that they can address those. But the nutritional composition of those crops is also something that we're definitely looking at. And so we are looking at, I know that one of our researchers has been working on developing a pulse variety that will absorb more zinc, because zinc deficiency is one of those things that causes blindness and other pieces. And when you're pulses are the best thing that you can possibly feed people, you need to have that kind of capacity as well because the diets are so limited. So we have all of those bit by bit, the capacities. We have scientists who have developed an understanding of the complete genetic makeup of some of these pulses, and if we can identify what the genes are doing and what they in groups drive to the other end, then it makes it easier for us to make some of those decisions. We also have people who are looking at how do we process these crops, because how you process them will influence the availability of some of these nutrients. But then you get into that human piece again, because if you are always used to having a thin crust pizza, okay, and you go to somebody else's house around the world and they offer you pizza and it's got a crust that is this thick, you don't like it very much and you might eat it because you're polite, but you're never going to eat it of choice. The other one that I always use is that most North Americans do not consider eating bugs, right? Just that ick factor. So we really have to take into consideration what people are used to eating, what their diets will accommodate, and how they are going to be able to process those foods in their homes. And that's some of the critical work that Carol and Susan and others have been doing, is working with the families who are now growing these crops, and then they need to be able to use them, and they need to be able to use them in ways that their neighbors aren't going to sneer at them about, because your neighbors would sneer if they knew you were picking worms and eating them, right? So it is a whole part of this sociological thing. But the other part about it is, and I'll stop really quickly, pulses aren't the only answer. It is not just what we do with the plants. It is how we manage the land. It is what kinds of fertilizers and where. It is how we make sure that those things are available to the people who need them. How do we manage the water? What are we doing in terms of land and soil management? What are the microorganisms in the soil that end up, it goes on and on and on, and it is a whole life cycle piece, and animals are a critical part of it too. So, I mean, nature uses animals, nature uses these things. We need to be looking at a whole life cycle approach and enabling the technologies and the knowledge that we have to be adapted to both the social and geographical conditions of the folks that we're working with. It's a very, very complex problem, and it's part of why we all need to work together in order to make a difference. And boy, oh boy, do we ever need our farmers to make this thing happen.
Mary, thank you so much. It's a life cycle approach, as you said. Brian, we're going to ask you to help us think about some of the linkages between some of the participants here and more broadly based, and that is, what makes a successful partnership? What should we be thinking about?
Thanks, Rob. Well, I guess to preface that, what makes a successful partnership, I guess the first thing you notice when you look at the World Nutrition Report is that Canada represents about 0.47% of the world's population of 7.6 billion, but we really hit above the belt when it comes to having done this research, to having the structure that can actually really harvest a lot of the latent energy and resources that we have here. And another interesting observation that I've made of late is that a lot of these reports are actually very gloomy. And I know that Dominic inserted a few slides of the good news, but I think that for people to be inspired, it's not as much cognitively that we need to motivate people with more information on millions and millions and hundreds of thousands and percentages. It's also emotionally. To be involved, so to be on board, I think that's going to be important to actually produce the change that we need among the consortia and the associations that we formed. And an example that I have is, for example, did you know that Canada is a pioneer in vitamin A supplementation around the world? Nutrition International, the organization I work for, used to be called Micronutrient Initiative. We supply 160 million children with 2 doses of vitamin A per year with the help of the Canadian government, to have supported that over all the years for the science that was done, for the distribution channels that were enabled with the cooperation with UNICEF that Canada also supports with. Other examples is, did you know that Canada was a pioneer in iodizing salt through the, pure salt iodization, but also double fortified salt with iron as well. And that's through University of Toronto, Sick Kids, Micronutrient Initiative, and other players in Canada. So we have these real success stories that have very low cost interventions that have a massive impact around the world. So the stats are staggering in terms of can make you depressed, but they can also, you can also think about these really massive success stories that make me hope that actually we can develop things today that will make a big difference for hundreds of millions of people. None of these examples that I gave you would have happened without collaboration between the scientific sides, community, the universities, for example, government support, as well as NGO support, of course, but also the governments in the countries we work in. All of this will not work unless you have the buy-in of the different ministries and associations in those countries. We think of them sometimes as corrupt or unable to get with the program, and that's not just simply not the case in many of the countries that we work in. Another side example, but that I'm just going to take this platform because I hope that we get some of these questions, is the world's population keeps increasing. We don't talk about population demography checks. People will often say to me, well, why do you care if it's like 10 million people or 10 million children are affected by X stunting or whatever, and they say they just have to have smaller families, right? Instead of having 8 children, the mother should have 2. Then you wouldn't have as many mouths to feed and so on. And this is not to go down that slippery slope, but it's to give you examples of places like Bangladesh have gone from 5.6 children per woman to 2 in one generation. They actually have the same number of children as Canadians right now. And China's like that. There's a whole bunch of countries like that as well. So it is not about population growth per se that is the problem. In this context, and I just wanted to deflect that potential issue at the pass. And so that the first step was to really reinforce the pride and the good examples that we already have in Canada of these successful collaborations. The second one is to work with non-traditional players. For example, we work with the United Nations Population Fund. So UNFPA works in 29 countries, reaching hundreds of millions of women with reproductive health services and fertility advice. And the Canadian government's also very supportive. The US has gone way down in their funding for this, but we've worked with them to integrate nutrition into their existing platforms. If they can reach hundreds of millions of women that we cannot, then we can use that as a delivery platform to insert nutrition messaging. The other example that is very exciting now, and one of the reasons I'm here, is that we're working with the University of Saskatchewan on lentil fortification. So we've talked about the climate reducing the nutritional content of foods. For example, lentils will be lower in iron. Why not fortify them? Flours are fortified, oil is fortified, and it's regulated in Canada and many other countries. And by working on this project with U of S, we're actually introducing fortified lentils into Bangladeshi communities, and Saskatchewan lentils are very high in selenium. They bind with the arsenic, that people have very high arsenic poisoning as well in Bangladesh, causes all sorts of skin problems, et cetera. And so Saskatchewan lentils are fantastic for that. We're not thinking about 10,000 people. We're thinking about 100 million people could be consuming fortified products in Bangladesh through Canadian technology and partnerships. And then the third key element is really I would say the government at the federal level and the provincial level using diplomacy, trade alliances, and other instruments to align with trade and tariff policies. For example, India has 40% or 30 to 40% tariff on lentils, for example. What would happen if that went down to 20% or 10%? You're not necessarily asking them to eliminate them, but we need the government support on those areas as well, because to have the partnerships, to have the science, to reach the people of the world's populations, really, I think Canada also needs to step up in terms of its influence and its brand to influence those extremely important macroeconomic factors as well. Thank you.
Well, that's terrific. I mean, it's helpful for us to get a sense of that global perspective. You know, I think the U.S. just passed its major agriculture bill, and just before Christmas, and it's connected into its national food program through schools. And Yvonne, I was just wondering if you might talk to us a little bit. If I'm not mistaken, I think Canada is the only G8 country not to have a national school food policy. And
That's right.
I just wonder if you might be able to help us on what that looks like, or what some of the consequences may be more locally.
Yeah, so thanks, Rob. I work for an organization, it's called CHEP Good Food, and CHEP is a local community-based organization here in Saskatoon that works in a host of various programs and services to the community, the wider community. And so those include things like school feeding programs, collective kitchens, support for people who wish to garden, and also access to food programs such as the Good Food Box, fresh food markets, and nutrition education. So our organization works with folks locally who would be food insecure. And that's not a homogenous group. Typically, though, households that are food insecure are low income, those relying on social assistance as their main source of income, those who do not own their own dwelling, women, single-headed households, Aboriginal populations living off-reserve, and new immigrant households. So CHEP has long been involved. In fact, our organization found its way 30 years ago as the Child Hunger and Education Program, and working with schools in both divisions to ensure that children who attended school, who didn't have a breakfast, who had no lunch, were able to access food, healthy food, at school while, enhancing their learning outcomes, etc. We have since been involved in organizations such as Food Secure Canada. There's a large coalition of 47 organizations, NGOs, such as Diabetes Canada, Heart and Stroke, who are part of the coalition called Coalition for Healthy School Food. And in that work, CHEP is involved in trying to make a pitch to the federal government that it needs a national school food policy. We're the only G8 country that does not have one. And secondly, that the feds should put dollars towards enhancing the capacity for Canadians to have this. So we believe that the work of having school food not only would address some of the issues that we're talking about within the Global Nutrition Report, such as obesity among Canadian children, but also in areas such as the far north, where you have 45%, almost 50% of the population that are living in food insecure households. Being able to have children attend school, for parents not to have the burden of wondering, are their children going to eat? If not, how are they going to make the food dollars within the household stretch enough to send a healthy snack or meal to school? That we would alleviate that burden from parents. It also would be a perfect place to enact more of the Canada Food Guide, which just was released last week, to ensure that some of the ideas behind what it is around healthy eating, how we want our population to be best served by introduction of pulses, introduction of different kinds of grains, introduction of fruits, vegetables that we all know contribute to a healthier diet, that a school nutrition program would be the place where we would inject that kind of education. And we think that the outcomes, the health outcomes that would come from that would be enormous. So that's the kind of initiatives that CHEP is involved with. We think that it would be a really important way. And CHEP is involved in a few things locally. Dr. Henry is involved with us in doing a pilot with some schools to try to get some pulses in the children's lunch programs. And so that's one way that we're trying to just inject ideas within schools just to get them thinking about this issue.
That's terrific. And I stumbled my way through. The actual U.S. bill is the Agricultural Improvements Act 2018. Bob Tyler would know that, also known as the Farm Bill. Projected $428 billion of funding over 5 years for a vast array of programs. The majority of it, 76%, goes to nutrition programs such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. So there's just one example of a major initiative that's recently passed down in the States that speaks, at least in part, to a policy gap that you've identified. Thank
Rob,
you.
can I just say one more thing? There's 151 countries worldwide that actually have school food programs. So the fact that Canada doesn't even have one is a bit appalling.
So it's G8 plus, we'll just say.
Plus.
Yeah. Paul, we're going to ask you about reflecting a little bit on those that who are around the world that are still struggling in poverty and can't afford to purchase, whether from Canada or elsewhere, nutritional commodities. And I'm just wondering what that might look like and what some potential steps forward may be.
Thank you, Rob. Just to let folks know, the organization I work with, Canadian Food Grains Bank, works in about 40 countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America, always on food assistance, nutrition, agriculture work. So we have a good deal of experience. And from our own programming experience, we've seen something called nutrition-sensitive agriculture as being very effective. I think Dominic mentioned nutrition-sensitive approaches to dealing with malnutrition. And I'll just tell you a very quick example. This came from some projects that we were working on in Malawi. It was actually nurses in the hospital who identified the problem. They said, all these farms around here, like we're surrounded by farms, everything looks green, the crops look great, how come we've got so many undernourished kids coming into the hospital? And they quickly realized that the farms were all growing maize or corn, and the kids and their parents were eating maize and maize and maize and maize. They were getting plenty of calories, but they weren't getting adequate nutrition. And so through our program work, we introduced legumes. And we didn't go to the farmers and say, here, grow this. We worked with what we called farmer research teams. So we would go to farmers, most of whom were women, and we'd say, here's 3 or 4 different kinds of pulses or legumes. We want you to try interplanting these with your maize, see what works well, and then we want you to harvest these and eat them. The seeds, but also the leaves, because people eat lots of leaves of different vegetables, and figure out different ways to cook them and figure out what your kids like. And then come together in groups and share this with the other families. And so people were testing things in the field, bringing back their own results, sharing recipes. Well, in very short order, we found that yields were up, income was up, malnutrition was down, soil was getting improved, but not only that, but the women's roles in the household was improving because now they actually had more income and they had more decision-making power. So it was solving a whole lot of problems all at once. So that's an example of nutrition-sensitive agriculture, which we're now doing in many countries. And in terms of what Canada can do besides exporting, growing and exporting more crops, which we do very well, I think one thing Canada can do is increase support for things like that in our aid program. I think many people don't realize that aid levels, the total amount of money that Canada uses to support international development, is at a 50-year low. It's the lowest it's now. It's lower now than it's been in the last 50 years, and that's shocking considering how well our economy overall is doing. Within that, support for agriculture is in decline and support for nutrition is in decline. So I think Canada could do a lot more in terms of the aid program. Besides that, I think there's a lot that the broader agricultural sector can do, and I've started some conversations with the folks at PIC and some conversations with the folks here at University of Saskatchewan on sharing ideas from Canada. So we can send out boatloads of lentils, that's great. We can also send out ideas from Canada. The ideas on conservation agriculture, for instance. Ideas that work very well on 10,000 acres here work very well also on 1 acre elsewhere. Same principles, different tools, sure, but same principles work very well in terms of soil and water conservation. So those ideas, other ideas like farm organizations, which are strong here and have delivered a lot of benefits for rural Canada, we can export those ideas and get those farm organizations, agricultural co-ops, things like that, to help to solve the problems in countries that are not as well off as here. So there's a few ideas.
Thank you so much. You know, someone who is associated with working with big ideas and local communities and global communities is Susan Whiting. And Susan, you've just done terrific work. You've joined us in Ethiopia, but I know your work in many, many other areas. And so can you talk to us a little bit about what malnutrition looks like? What that, as you come across it at a community level, how do we begin to recognize it and what you associate with that?
Well, it's been really interesting today that people have in some of their stories talked about it, and children really show malnutrition so well. Unfortunately, Mary's anecdote about the farmer whose children were growing strong and healthy, it just indicates that the diet that these children were eating indicated that, good weight, good height. Recently, and people may have noticed in Dominic's presentation, the major indicator that's being used is stunting. I think it's because height for age, and so this is height for age, not just height, is a really powerful indicator on a population level of what people are eating. And so when your diet is only maize, you're just not getting enough of all the amino acids needed to attain normal height. Or if a child is ill for any reason, they're not really going to be able to utilize any of the food that they're eating. And so stunting has become the major indicator. Just to be careful, it doesn't mean that anyone who is tall, and I come from a tall family, and my niece just married someone 6'6", so who knows how many more tall kids there will be in the Whiting clan. But it's not an absolute tall equals everything's perfect and short is you're falling apart. But on a population level, you only expect the height for age to be below the 2 standard deviations in a very small proportion, 2.5%. So what we're seeing and the indications from Ethiopia when they started to pay attention to nutrition was that 58% of children were stunted. And this was a statistic that I think prompted them to do a lot of the nutrition work that we've been able to contribute to as well. And some of it is measuring what you need to address, so it's important to know these things. They have lowered this stunting rate from 58% to about, I think I was looking at it the other day, 40%. Now, they still are very high, one of the highest countries in the world, but within that 10 or so years, they've implemented 2 national nutrition programs, and the second of which came out a few years ago actually focused on nutrition-sensitive agriculture, so that really fits into all the things we've been doing. On a micro level, we had a PhD student who's now with us and writing her thesis do a nutrition education program in Ethiopia to have the mothers realize the importance of adding a pulse, a locally grown pulse, to their complementary foods. And it was primarily education. We gave them small tastes, but we didn't provide the food. It was being grown. And we now are looking at the student's thesis, and she's seeing a significant drop in stunting. And now, it was a fairly large group. It was almost 1,000 families, 500 in the intervention and 500 in control. But it does show that even some modest things can improve malnutrition. And then the idea is that you don't just focus on one thing, but you focus on many. So this, along with other innovations that were mentioned in the report, could help not just Ethiopia, but other countries as well.
Susan, thank you. Stephen, you're here with the Global Institute for Food Security, which I had a little bit to do with, and so I'm delighted to see the progress. Tell me where Global Institute for Food Security, where you see it fitting in to help address some of the fundamental issues or big questions that Dominic helped pose for us.
Yes, well, thank you. So I've just arrived in Canada a few weeks ago to take up the role in the Global Institute for Food Security, and I have to say it's a real privilege, and I'm very excited by what I've discovered here and across all the organisations. The Global Institute was set up to address agriculture for the benefit of both Canada and the rest of the world, and we've been quietly working away below the headlines for a year or two while we got ourselves established, with some great recruitments made from leading scientists from around the world. And we're focusing on some particular areas in relation to soils, into seeds and seed development, and using digital agriculture. But one of the things we do know is that we can't do it all ourselves. We have a remit to help both Canada and the developing world. And part of our philosophy has been to work in partnership and with many different disciplines from both around Saskatchewan and across Canada and internationally. And we see a real power in that forming those partnerships and working in that way. Now, I heard Carol earlier on talk about the Saskatchewan village analogy, in a sense, and I've heard some fantastic ideas and lots of common sense things said here today. And so the way that I hope that we can start to position the Global Institute for Food Security is as a partner and a catalyst and a helper to bring people together, to bring different disciplines together, and to draw on our connections both here and around the world. I've had a privilege to sort of 10 years or so before I came here, working in the research environment in the UK on a lot of international collaboration, and was privileged to be part of some of those projects that have led to the UK being the highest donor we saw from one of the slides for international development. And that is leading to some fresh thinking in the way in which partnerships are put together and collaboration. And I suspect that many of the problems we've talked about here today, we could have spoken about for many years, and I have a sense that we need to just try and do some things a little bit differently. And I think it's that sense of really committing to a partnership together and planning those partnerships with a degree of care. I heard this morning, just as a brief analogy, about a project to build a very complicated nuclear power station in the UK, and the amount of care and attention that went into that. If we think about some of the scale of the challenges that have been presented to us today, and we want to pull together many different disciplines, we have to plan that carefully as well as have lots of good ideas. So my hope is that we can do our small part to work with colleagues here and others to help move forward this critically important agenda. I particularly, hear the comment from Jean about the farmers' involvement and speaking with the farmers and recognise that a lot of research in the past has been focused on higher yield without really being worried about nutrition. We're now moving into an age where the researchers have some wonderful tools, and still more are being developed, that we can design both higher yielding plants and more nutrition, and address things like climate change challenges as well. It's a really exciting age for plant breeders, and so things that were impossible a few years ago can be done, and so I feel a sense of optimism as we look forward.
Well, it's that spirit of optimism. We'll look down the table and see Victoria. And Victoria, dietetic student here on campus. And we're just wondering if you can help the rest of us shine a bit of a light, maybe a little further than some of us can see. What do you think are some of the elements we should pay attention to as we think about pulses, as we think about helping to meet these Sustainable Development Goals, especially overcoming malnutrition, from where you sit and some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thanks. So it's been pretty interesting growing up, watching the obesity epidemic happening, and also seeing the pulse trends sort of coming in. And yeah, it's been a unique experience. I've been really enjoying watching all of my colleagues here and listening to all the exciting things that they have to say. And I think that once we start to incorporate more pulses into our diet, and as we're talking about here, they'll slowly start to become a part of our culture and everything that we're doing. And I think that since I've been using pulses and growing up slowly incorporating them into my diet, I think that we won't have to convince people as much to use them, and that our children will just grow up, kind of incorporating them into their diet. And I really loved what my colleague down the lane here was talking about with the school lunch program. And so having pulses being a part of that would be really amazing, and I think that incorporating it into our culture. Something else that I would like to touch on that we've been talking about is how we have this double burden of disease. And so we've all been saying that there's been obesity and overweight occurring, and at the same time we see malnutrition and different nutrient deficiencies. And we've been talking about how we'll see them in the same country, in the same household, but we're also seeing them in the same individual. So a person can be experiencing different nutritional deficiencies and also be living with overweight or obesity. And so that's something that's new, and it's emerging. And I think that there's this narrative right now that I've been seeing a lot, where people think that individuals that are living with overweight or obesity can't be malnourished. And that's quite dangerous, because people would miss out on care that they could be getting. Yeah. And you'll see that obesity is literally masking nutritional deficiencies. And so it's exciting to see the role of pulses and all the things that they can do to help with that double burden.
Wow, Victoria, thank you. I think you've just helped all of us just to offer a reflection of things that maybe we had assumed and we need to examine. David, I promised I'd come back, and then we're going to open it up. I'm conscious of the time, so when we begin here with David, I'll probably play the role a little bit of speaker in the House, and that is a quick question and a quick response. I never abided by those rules, by the way, just so everyone knows. But David, I want to come back to you. You've heard a lot. We've heard a lot. When we think about a Canadian brand and this report, this nutritional report, the Sustainable Development Goals, some of the policy pluses that we've heard, I have to say that because Carol always says the pluses of pulses, but also some of those gaps. Can you just take 1 or 2 minutes and just kind of hit some high points, Canadian brand today and where we need to go 5 and 10 years out if we play a word association game around the world? What's Canada, what should we be doing?
Did you say a 20-minute response? I'll try my best. I reflected on the nutrition report, and there was a phrase in there that I thought was interesting. The first step to speed up progress is a need for greater integration in the health community. And I thought about that, and I went, I think that's not only part of the answer. We need a whole of government approach in policymaking. We need greater collaboration across the supply chains, and we need the agriculture sector to be working with the health sector, to be working with the environmental research community to help respond to these complex issues. That's what we need globally. But what do we need again for Canada? I think it's what's the reputation we want to nurture going forward? We have a great reputation now, and essentially, what's that brand? And I'm just going to reflect on some of the comments I just heard and over the last second or so, a few minutes or so, and that is, are we not the place? Are we not the country that can actually increase yield, increase the nutritional quality of the foods we produce, and be resilient, more resilient as best we can to climate change and sustainability pressures? What a brand that would be to sell our products to our consumers at home and consumers abroad, whether it's at the commodity level, whether it's in animal or plant agriculture, or whether it's in the value-added space. That's a brand that I think is worth nurturing. And in fact, some of the things that we're doing, and I'll close off in a few seconds, we're actually doing some work at Canada 2020 right now on this, and we're holding a national forum in November to pull diverse stakeholders together right after the federal election to give visibility to the importance of this incredible sector at a formative time in the policy agenda and try to illuminate what will stand behind the Canada Food brand.
David, thank you. I hope you'll see this as maybe a little bit of a tutorial as you focus on that. All right, so now we're going to do our best to take as many questions. We're conscious of the time, but with your indulgence, I know that great questions are here. So if we can be succinct in the questions, and whether directed to an individual or perhaps to everyone, and equally succinct in our responses. We know that there's going to be a reception afterwards, and there'll be an opportunity for us to follow up perhaps a little more thoroughly. So I'm happy to entertain questions. Here's the dean, and I called him in his lab. I was a minister. I called him in his lab. It was announced he was coming. I called him. I said, "Hi, it's Rob calling," and I'm just.
I went in for a beer too.
Yeah, he came in. We went for a beer.
It shows how great our students are. Victoria, I thought, brought up a really important point where you kind of skirted it, but I'd like to hear more. How about the behavioral changes in people so they start to eat better? I mean, at the end of the day, one of the reasons why I love the childhood program, by the way, my kids are in that childhood program, and my 8-year-old daughter really thinks a lot differently about diet than certainly her dad does. So all the different things that you've talked about, wonderful, but how do we change people's ways of taking diet, getting them to want to take pulses or any nutritional food? Because someone made the comment about drinking pop and having thick pizza over thin pizza. I mean, it's a real problem changing people's behavior. Could maybe someone speak to that? And I think the children's program is maybe one way to do that, getting them thinking about it when they're kids. But I'd love to hear a little bit more.
We don't want to stop the dean, but you were kind of filibustering your own time.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I've learned from you, Rob.
Yeah.
I can maybe illuminate a little tiny bit on that. So in addition to the children's programming that we do, we have a collective kitchen program, which is literally a program with a number of, it's sort of like a suite of programs that we do. Like there's one part of it is called a grub and gab. Another part is actually collective kitchens where groups of people will cook together. And so they'll decide on the recipes, they'll cook, they'll maybe try new ingredients that they've never tried before. And what we've always said is that people come for the food, but they stay for the friendship. So, I mean, socially, we are social beings. And one of the things that has to be, I think, a part of any kind of food discussions we do, any kind of like nutrition education that we've been involved with, we find the best success is when it's done socially, is when it's done with groups of people and that they're engaging with one another. Food, we love food, right? So why hold back and just make it this sort of didactic kind of experience? It's not that. Food has to be social. It has to be in the company of others. We need to break bread with one another.
So Aristotle called us social creatures. So the notion that this is a community-based discussion is just reinforced. Next question.
Rob, can I?
Yeah, sure.
Just add a,
Yeah.
It is an incredibly important question, but from the other countries' point of view, not the Western countries, but I'll get the example, Indonesia, for example, where we're working with an organization that's developing mobile technology platforms so that it's a walled garden for girls, basically, so that it's a safe zone that they can communicate and share on all sorts of issues, health included. And we've partnered with them to introduce nutrition messaging. And number one thing that those girls care about is the same adolescent girls is their body image. So if you eat fruits and vegetables and pulses and they'll make you slimmer or they'll make your complexion more shiny, then they're in, right? So that was pretty obvious maybe to a parent of a teen. However, so some of those are common. Some of the things that aren't common are misconceptions about certain foods that you wouldn't imagine here, and you feel like laughing sometimes, but it's not that funny when somebody says, watermelon will cause pregnancy in Indonesia. So there's information as well about the basic elements around some of these foods. That was one example. The other one is the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts. We've partnered with them to actually develop a nutrition badge. It's the first time that the Girl Guides actually have this badge. Cool. And it's modules that are developed. There's 5 modules for the different age groups. So my point was, how do you change behaviors? Well, the 0 to 5 is different from a 17 to 20-year-old, obviously. And so these modules are supposed to reflect these latest thinking and behavior change, where it's participatory. Girls and boys perceive it differently, so you really have to slice and dice individually. And the countries, so the badge is actually adapted by the Girl Guides to 20 countries to make it good for the Philippines, good for Indonesia, and the messages are quite different. So I think I'm saying a lot of things, except you use modern technology, you have to realize that their perception of things might just blow your mind in terms of what will actually get them to consume pulses or other more healthy foods, which has nothing to do with the health benefits of that.
It's a great answer. Excellent. Okay. Next question. Yeah.
I don't know whether you know what
There's a mic.
school kids. What do school kids eat in Hungary? They eat lentil soup made out of lentil grown in Saskatchewan. So I wonder why can't our kids eat lentil soup in Saskatchewan schools? So actually, my question is, although nobody is here from the provincial government, but what are the ways what is the role of the provincial government to create that environment? You work, Yvonne, with the federal government, but what is the role of the provincial government to create that structure and so that kids can actually eat lentils grown in Saskatchewan?
We do actually get support from the provincial government for all of our programs and services, but largely for the school nutrition program. So it comes from the Ministry of Education, the Child Nutrition Program. So about 1/3 of our funding actually comes from the province. It's not enough, actually. So just, Rob, if you have any still friends in that, it's just a little dig.
I appreciate your optimism that I had friends.
But it's something which I think probably we could use some support, and I would think that it would be really quite appropriate. And I know that there used to be this thing called the RIC, the Regional Intersectoral Committees, which were actually cross-departmental, and we've been mourning a little bit at the loss of the RICs, because what it allowed the community to do is to have a number of different players within government, as well as the community and the NGO sectors, to have dialogue. And without that dialogue, there actually hasn't been a replacement of opportunities that the NGO sectors have had with the provincial government. So it's a bit of a loss for the communities, I think, to not have some formal structures within government to have that sort of dialogue, because I'm not sure that the provincial government actually knows on a week-to-week or monthly basis the kinds of work in the community that's happening, and we don't really have a mechanism, an easy mechanism, with which to inform them. So I think that those are the kinds of things that, in order to really promote work in food insecurity and to boost how the community is addressing these issues, we need to have formal mechanisms with government with which to have this dialogue.
Perfect. Mary.
Just very briefly, constitutionally, it's basically illegal for the federal government to do anything with education, right? It is a provincial responsibility. So for the federal government to get involved in a school food program would take an awful lot of negotiation and financial support, aka bribery of the provinces, to help that kind of thing happen. It would arguably be more constitutionally possible for the provincial governments to set up some kind of nutrition program within the schools of a province, which would lead to provincial differences, but would, like probably a lot of things, spread across the country. So it's one of those things that can start locally and then spread nationally.
Rob, can I add that actually the provincial government supports Eat Well Saskatchewan program and has been supporting that for a number of years. That's a community-based program that is like a call center to help with nutritional needs. And recently, they've gotten money from the feds in partnership with the province to help the Indigenous community. So there are programs, and in fact, it's unfortunate. Minister Merriman was actually supposed to be here today, the Minister of Social Services, and Paul and I are pretty good friends. And Paul has actually been a big supporter of the nutrition program and some of the things in terms of nutritional programs and needs and so on. So there is some provincial traction here, but I think to our colleagues there can be more. So I don't want people to think that there's no provincial traction, because that is not true.
And I always like to remind people, Section 95 of the Canadian Constitution, there are concurrent powers. There are two: immigration and agriculture. And so when we think about the U.S. Farm Bill, there's plenty of opportunity for federal-provincial collaboration on this issue. It's not a paid commercial. All right, I'm a little bit conscious of our time, and our refreshments and some food are coming. We've got time for maybe one or two quick questions. Yeah, yes, sir. Go ahead.
I'm a researcher in food science area, and I really love POSES because it gives us so many research opportunities. We work with the use of POSES to develop low glycemic, either human food or pet food. We can also do a lot of value-added processing of the POSES. So it's kind of interesting when we really look at the industry now. Is as we heard from today's meeting, you can just add the POSES to the diet, then to really bring up the nutritional value to improve the nutritional status of people in different parts of the world. But also we have company like in California, they came up with the brilliant idea to add the pea protein, and then along with many, many other ingredients to prepare the Beyond Meat burger. So my question is, like, when we really look at the big picture, like think about what Canada is going to do in terms of like the sustainability, profitability, and also the nourishment of people in different parts of the world. Can some of you share some of the idea, like should we go with the traditional way, just simply add POSES to the food, or should we do more of the value-added processing? I'm not against either way, but just could some of you share some of your thoughts? Yeah, thank you.
What a great question to wrap up on, and I'm going to hand it back to Carol. So why don't we just go quickly down the line and just really, really quick responses to a very, very thoughtful question, and then we'll be able to continue our conversation and dialogue over into the reception. Mary, do you want to start?
I think we need to do absolutely everything. Give it all a try and see what sticks.
In the context we're working in, a lot of most of the folks we work with are smallholder farmers that are growing, eating what they grow. They eat very little processed food, so it makes sense to encourage them to grow pulses, eat pulses, and get the diversity that way.
Many solutions need the private sector, and I would favour a pilot project with an area picked out by private sector partners.
Our study was actually encouraging mothers to use pulses in complementary foods, because even though the family might have eaten them, they didn't think they were appropriate for very young children. So this was a misconception that we were. So it was about adding pulses in this context.
Thank you for your question. My view would be, why are we allowing the Californian company or the American company to come up and innovate on this sort of thing? And we should be more nimble and do it here. And I think the person to help do that is sitting right beside me.
Yeah, I'm kind of agreeing with Mary. I think the answer is both, and we can't take a blanket approach to the market, and I think we've probably done that a little too much in terms of value-added research in Western Canada. If we build it, they will come. I think we got to get the voice of the consumer, think about segmenting our market, and there's lots of opportunity to service all of those markets, but we really need the voice of the consumer in there.
I know for a lot of the folks that we work with, they're often a value add to already existing foods that they're culturally more comfortable in eating and things like that. So, and slowly we start to extract them and do things like lentil salads and so on. And so they're actually standalone. But at this point, I think a good way to potentially introduce pulses into the diet is by, I don't want to use this word, but I can't think of any other word to use, is masking it with other foods.
I think ultimately anything that can reduce the price of the pulses or the value-added component of the pulses would actually increase the market tremendously. And I don't want it to sound like a broken record, but I think that the government also has to help out on these trade barriers that exist between countries. And I know that has nothing to do with the actual processing of the food, but the food categorization when it hits the border is very different, whether it's a whole grain or pulse, or whether it's a processed. And there's so many variations, and there's so much opportunity to work with those governments, because you wouldn't believe the tariffs that are on these products once they hit the border.
For my perspective on this, from a Global Affairs Canada perspective, we work with smallholder farmers. The easiest way, as my colleague said down the line, that the easiest way is to give them to the smallholder farmers, give them to the women, let them try them out, see what works, try out different recipes. We've discussed this previously. Find out what works for you, and hopefully it'll catch on.
Advertising pulses to children, adolescents, and university students would be very beneficial. They could start eating them from a young age, and then just continue to incorporate them into their diet because they'll be used to them. Also, having different products, just a variety of products available. Pea protein chips, I saw those the other day. Stuff like that is great and trendy, and people can get on board with it.
So I spent 5 years on the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers Development Commission. And I love all this optimism that if we do it, they will come. Saskatchewan farmers have spent a fortune trying to do this exact thing. And you know what? It's had relatively low success. So I don't know what the answer is. But I do know that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So if we actually break out of those silos that we talked about in in the preamble to today's meeting, maybe we can figure out, without going back and doing that, maybe we can figure out those partnerships. A lot of that work has been done. And as farmers, we are more than willing to participate in it. But again, I don't know what the answer to your question is, but I do certainly know that if we could get every farmer that grew a pulse in this country to bloody eat it, we'd really help it out a lot. Thank you.
Rob, I feel like we're just getting warm and we need another hour. But I know the ladies won't let me. So I just want to say a few thank yous quickly, and then I'm going to ask you to take the conversation outside. We have good food. We have pulse, Jean. We have pulse on the menu. We also have posters, and we've got SAS made, and we want you to look at the marketplace as well. Rob, thank you. Dominic, good job. To our panel, great job. Thank you so very much for stimulating the conversation. Reno from Genome Prairies was here, and I just happened to walk outside as he was leaving. He said, this has to be the beginning of the conversation. So we're hoping that we will bring you back. And to our great audience, thank you so much for being here. We're sorry that we didn't get all the questions. We know that you will ask the panel a few as you go through. Shauna is standing back there. She made me this long list of thank yous, and she forgot to put herself on it. Shauna is our organizer. Thank you so much, Shauna. I also want to thank Agwes Bayer. Well, when we said that, could you partner with us, he jumped quickly to it. And then he not only said yes to that, but he said you could have our whole system, the ladies who work with registration and everything. So we want to thank the ladies who work so well with Shauna, and thank Wilf for great collaboration. To the ladies in the Edith Roll Simpson Lecture Committee, super good. We didn't do a lecture, but I think this represented her very well. We also want to thank our media, who we asked at the last minute. They've done a good job, and we want to thank them as well. To Michael and team communication, they have been busy sending out the tweets, and you will see a short article, Michael, of all of this that will come out next. Have I missed anyone? If I have missed you, Matthew's looking at me and saying, we did the poster, what are you doing? To our poster, who organized our poster, and to the ladies who are outside in the marketplace, thank you, thank everyone. Let's go outside and continue the conversation.